It's become almost pro forma that after something horrible like Orlando, a massacre, a shooting, a murder, or a natural disaster, politicians of all political ilk step forward and say, our thoughts and prayers are with A, B, and C. Well, someone who has been offering more than thoughts and prayers, actually meaningful policy, on behalf of the state of California and specifically the LGBT community and his district here in San Francisco, is our next guest, Mark Leno, Senator from California. Welcome.
David, thank you. Good to be with you.
You know, we've been talking all day about Orlando. Where were you when you first heard about it, and what were your thoughts?
I was at home. It was very early Sunday morning, and dumbfounded, horrified, just like everybody else.
Mm-hmm. Was your reaction instantly, oh my goodness, this is an attack on the gay community? What was your, did you go there, I guess is what I'm trying to get at?
From the early information that we had, it was impossible to think otherwise. Clearly, the media were focused on terrorism, and foreign terrorism at that, Islamic terrorism at that. I was really disappointed. Even my beloved Morning Edition on NPR had interview after interview after interview, and I never heard the word homophobia. I was really, that got me as angry as what I learned on Monday morning. This was a hate crime against our community. But of course, violence against our community is hardly anything new. Our march toward equal rights and liberation has been bathed in violence and blood. So we're very familiar with it. You know, about 20% of all hate crimes are against members of our community. And we are the most targeted among all groups for hate crimes. Our metropolitan community churches have been firebombed and set ablaze over the decades. Our bars have been attacked before. We used to be attacked in our bars by our local police.
Even here in San Francisco.
With their billy clubs, with their fists. We were criminals by definition of law. Consensual acts of same-sex adults were considered felonies, even here in California, until 1976. Of course, we were on the list of mental disorders as determined by the American Psychiatric Association until 1973. So it's all very recent that we're not mentally ill outlaws. And so I share all this with you because this kind of violence, now or at any time in the past, does not happen in a vacuum. It happens in a context, a social and political context. So we read these ironically tragic stories of the surviving gay men who were HIV negative, had been in the club, lost their brothers and sisters, could not even give their blood at time of a blood crisis and shortage. Why? Because to this day, our federal government bases a regulation and policy not based on science, but based on fear and prejudice that I, as an HIV negative gay man, cannot give my blood. And what does that communicate to the public? By our federal government, there's something dangerous about the blood that runs through our veins. You've got the lieutenant governor of the state of Texas putting up on his website a quote from the New Testament saying, man shall reap what he sows, suggesting that those who died had it coming. These are from supposedly respectable voices from our community, and then there were crazy people like this pastor in Sacramento who said they all should have died. This is God's vengeance on gay people. But this is the social and political context in which this happens. And then let's not overlook the fact that there are Jim Crow laws on the books in half the states. The federal government still has no protection from discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity for employment, housing, or public accommodation. That's the current state of affairs today.
Right.
So the message young people get, and of course this violence is mostly done by young adults, is that there is something bad and wrong about us, and they should take it into their own hands.
Right. So, everything that you just said is known to those of us who live and work in the community, have some connection to the community or politics, especially here in the Bay Area. You could have given that same speech 5 years ago and would have been identical. Why does it take something like in Orlando to make people pay attention? And do you think that they will? I mean, now we're 10 days out from this horrible attack. And, I have talked at length this week how personally I've been impacted, but everyone to whom I speak in the gay community still feels impacted. Is this going to die away and just become forgotten? Or is Orlando a tipping point politically in some way?
We'll only know with some hindsight. The public attention shifts very quickly, fades very quickly. The president and Congress, at least mostly Democrats in Congress, still sit in just last night to get some national attention on the fact that the majority party, the Republican Party, so dominated by the National Rifle Association, despite the fact that 90% of Americans polled, that means Republicans and Democrats alike by strong majorities, believe that if you can't fly on an airplane because you are on a list that the government has that you are possibly linked to some terrorist activity, that you shouldn't be able to buy a firearm. Now, this is not restricting people from what the Supreme Court has ruled as a Second Amendment right to possess weapons. But should these kinds of people be able to access not just a handgun, but automatic weapons like this fellow in Orlando?
Right.
If he didn't have an automatic weapon, a fraction of the people would have died.
No, I mean, I guess, I'm going to ask you just a very politically pointed question. You're a member of the California State Senate. You're a Democrat. What is it going to take to enact meaningful gun legislation on a national level? I mean, is the NRA still as potent here in June of 2016 as they were in June of 2006 or 1996?
Well, it depends where you're talking about. So the good news here in California is we have some of the most significant gun safety laws, and we should even watch the way we talk about our language. It's not about gun control. It's about gun safety and gun violence protection legislation. So we have some of the most significant in the country, but we still have some holes. And we have a package of bills moving through the legislature right now. We hope to get every piece of them to the governor. He's vetoed some of these bills in similar form in the past. And if we're not successful, there's likely to be a November ballot measure this year, which will let the voters speak. Now, it will be a big battle, and there's concern that that measure might bring out a lot of right-wing voters that may not otherwise vote, but then it may also bring out a lot of more thoughtful people who want gun safety laws in place. So I'm talking about the fact that it's easier to walk in and buy ammunition than it is to buy pseudoephedrine. Pseudoephedrine, you've got to show your identification, you've got to sign a log, you're in the system. Ammunition, there's nothing.
When you speak to your colleagues on both sides of the aisle, behind closed doors, not in the glare of the cameras, not in front of the NRA or whatever the group is that's supporting them or funding their campaigns, what do people say to you on both sides of the aisle about this? Is it recognized on a human level by politicians that something needs to change?
Again, it depends upon who you're talking about. Some of my colleagues may be operating due to intense political pressure in their districts. Others are just true believers. When we're talking about these kinds of gun safety laws, though, if you talk about LGBT civil rights, I doubt that there are many who believe the nonsense. But up until very recently, even in California, there have been Republicans who just refuse to vote for the most basic. I can give you an example because we just had one on our floor today. Since the Supreme Court decision recognizing that there will be legal same-sex marriages,
just a year ago
at this time across the country, I authored a bill a year ago to update our family code to remove the words husband and wife so that it will be, those individuals will be referred to as spouses in code so it doesn't conflict with the law of the land. Mm-hmm. It passed with maybe 1 or 2 or 3 Republicans and all Democrats. Keep in mind, it's the law of the land. So there was a very conservative Christian, I say that in the best sense of the word, sincere Christian colleague of mine from the northern part of the state who voted for the bill. And as I will often do when I'm pleasantly surprised by a Republican colleague, I cross the room to go to his desk and say, thank you very much, Senator, for supporting that bill. Given that so few of your colleagues did, can I ask you why you did? And he looked at me quizzically and so innocently and beautifully, he said, well, Mark, it is the law. I know. Thank you, sir. It is the law. Yeah. So today, Democratic colleague of mine from Santa Barbara had a similar bill, but to bring all our codes throughout our California statutes to replace husband and wife with spouse. And we had, out of 40, I think about 35 aye votes and no votes. So they're catching up.
They're catching up. It takes a while.
Yeah.
In the second half of the show, I want to come back and talk to you about how Orlando is changing politics nationally, but also specifically in California. What is the impact you've seen over the last couple of weeks on your colleagues? You know, is this something that is really going to impact our political dialogue going forward? We'll be back in just a few minutes.
Okay.
In the next few minutes, our further conversation with Senator Mark Leno. Thanks. Hi, I'm David Perry. Welcome back to 10%, our continuing conversation about the fallout from the Orlando shootings with our guest, Senator Mark Leno. You know, there's been so many threads to this story. My husband Alfredo said the day after it happened, this is the perfect story in a sense. It's got everything. It's the worst shooting. It's gay. It's Muslim. It's Latino. It's election year. It was almost too much to grasp. You know, one person... there's that old adage, one person dying is a tragedy, 1,000 dying is a statistic. Are we in danger of Orlando becoming a statistic, or is it really going to have a meaningful impact on politics for the rest of this year? Let's just stick to 2016 since we're in an election year.
I think we asked the same question when all those children got gunned down a couple of years ago. We couldn't believe that Congress would not finally act. I mean, what is more precious and embraceable than 5 and 6 and 7-year-old innocent kids being gunned down with an automatic weapon? Nothing. Absolutely no movement out of Washington. So that was very disheartening because there was real effort. The president used his voice and his bully pulpit to I won't say leverage, but not waste a crisis and a tragedy for good, and no one was budging. So I don't want to expect that this is going to be any different, but I think we've seen some movement already. As I mentioned earlier, the despicable comments and thoughts from the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, but on the other hand, the Lieutenant Governor of Utah put out a message saying that he apologized for not being more supportive of our community, being harsh with our community prior to this, that this had opened his eyes. So I can't believe he's alone. So there are people out there who who receive this as a slap to their own face, and it makes them think further as to, are they with the pastor who says all of them should have been killed? Is he indifferent? Or does he think, no, this is wrong, and what else might be wrong with the way I've been thinking?
Right, you know, I think sometimes we in California live in a bubble, certainly in Northern California. And, you know, politically, we have a Democratic, LGBT-friendly governor, district attorney, lieutenant governor,
Attorney General.
Attorney General.
Right.
What do your other LGBT colleagues around the country in state legislatures say? I mean, do you ever get calls or emails or tweets going, Mark, we'd love to pass something like this in Alabama? Or, you know, do you still get looked to, I guess is what I'm saying, for advice and counsel and just inspiration in other state legislatures?
We're not the only ones who recognize that we live in a very special,
Yeah.
uncommon, if not unique part of the earth. And that things that happen here begin here and move east, but that it does take some time. I'm going to digress just slightly here, but the ban on interracial marriage was in place across this country in certain spots until 1967.
Including my home state, Virginia.
Loving, Virginia. We all know that story. And 33 years later, year 2000, there were still 2 states in the country that had not yet gone through the perfunctory act of updating their state constitution to reflect that 1967 Supreme Court decision ending the ban on interracial marriage. And because they had to amend their constitutions, Alabama, South Carolina, they had to go to the voters. And that year, they went to the voters, and 40% of the voters in each state said no. So what I take from that is there are some people just never coming along. They're just steeped in their way of thinking. And that is the way this country works and our government works. We need 50% plus one to change the laws, and that begins to change hearts and minds. The hearts and minds come after we change the laws.
Right. Well, you know, my husband Alfredo has talked many times about how his country, Spain, passed marriage equality before the United States. But he said something that has stayed with me, which was, my country passed it as a law first, but the culture hasn't come along. He says, by the time we have marriage equality in the United States, the culture will have come along. I think a year ago when we were all celebrating marriage equality, there were a lot of us, myself included, that thought, wow, well, I mean, not everyone's with us, but, you know, the big hurdles are over. Do you think that's, I mean, in light of Orlando, that was just kind of a fantasy?
As tragic and horrifying as Orlando was and is, it is a single act of a single person. The violence against us in the streets, against transgender people in particular. In fact, most specifically, a vast majority of all the hate crimes against our LGBT community is against African American and Latino transgender people. So that exists on a daily basis. So I don't want to make too much out of Orlando. So one person's life could have gone in a different direction. We wouldn't be having this conversation. One person. So let's not make more of it than it is. But again, I was making the case that this happens in a context, not in a vacuum. And we got to change that context to get these crazy minds to realize that cannot and should not happen. And I also would add to this premise I'm laying out here that I'm not suggesting that this context gives license to this kind of violence, but at the same time, it doesn't discourage it. So we've got to change the context, and that's the kind of work you do, that's the kind of work I do, that's the kind of work so many advocates in our community do.
Do you ever get pessimistic about it?
By nature of personality and requirement of my job, I am a daily optimist.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know that about you, and people say that about you. But I mean, does it ever get difficult? I mean, I'm not trying to be silly, but I mean, are there times when you just say, God, I've been fighting the good fight for 30 years now, or however, I mean, I don't, you know, am I going to live long enough to change hearts and minds?
Well,
is it worth it?
It's important, no matter what we do in life, to count our blessings along the way, and to count small blessings along the way, and to recognize and cheer and celebrate what we do accomplish along the way. But it should not go without saying that we have enormous work to do, not only the half of the states in the country, as I mentioned, that still have no protection from discrimination based on gender identity or sexual orientation. The federal government has yet to do anything. We've got to change the majority in Congress, obviously. There's one reason that hasn't happened. And that may happen very soon. demographics of this country are changing. It's a younger population. This is not a debate for the younger population. So it's really a matter of time. It's when, not if.
Not if.
But we have very troubled youth because they suffer from this context. They're booted out of their homes. They're beat up psychologically, physically, sexually. And to realize that a third of the homeless people living on the streets in San Francisco are from our community, a third. We have seniors who still are afraid to live their life openly as they enter into their later years. Suicide rates are high. Smoking rates are high. A lot of work yet to do.
All right. We've just got about a minute and a half left. Talk to me specifically about two communities that really have had the light shown on them in the last 2 weeks because of Orlando. Not the LGBT community in general, but the Muslim gay community and the Latino gay community, or communities of color. What would you say to those two communities?
To continue to be a part of our coalition building, to continue to be a part of our rainbow coalition. Because by very definition, we are they and they are we. We're all the same community. Of course, there are LGBT Muslims, there are LGBT Latino community members. So we're all part of the same family, and we are stronger together, and we'll make our progress together.
Last question before we close. Of everything that was talked about the last 2 weeks, not just the violence, but the stories that came out, the political ramifications, was there any one story that stuck out for you as particularly meaningful, something that you'll carry away from this event?
I've read, there's so many, but I did read one story of a young gay male Latino couple who had just been married. They were in their early 20s. And I guess reflective upon all that we have experienced through the epidemic over the past number of decades, and to see young people die from our community so tragically, so senselessly, I was really touched to see that 49 is almost overwhelming, as you say, a statistic, but when you actually look at the faces and look at the names, it
so
just breaks your heart, breaks your heart.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for watching. I'm David Perry. Thank you, Mark Leno, for being with us, and thank you for watching every week, 10%.